Good evening. Cultural History of India. A.L. Basam. Introduction. A.L. Basam. There are four main cradles of civilization from which elements of culture have spread to other parts of the world. These are moving from east to west, China, the Indian subcontinent, the Fertile Crescent, and the Mediterranean, especially Greece and Italy. Of these four areas, India deserves a larger share of the credit than she is usually given, because on a minimal assessment, she has deeply affected the religious life of most of Asia and has provided very important elements in the culture of the whole of Southeast Asia, as well as extending her influence directly and indirectly to other parts of the world. It has been commonly believed in the West that before the impact of European learning, science and technology, the East changed little, if at all, over many centuries. The wisdom of the East, unchanging over the millennia, it was thought preserved eternal varieties which Western civilization has had almost forgotten. On the other hand, the East was not ready to enter into the rough and tumble of the modern world without the guidance for an indefinite period of more developed Western countries. In fact, India has always been steadily changing. The civilization of the Guptas was different from that of the Mauryas, and that of medieval time times was different again. The Muslim altered conditions considerably, and the high flowering of Indian Muslim civilization under the four great Mughals brought yet more changes. The religious life of India, for all her ancient wisdom, had changed greatly over the centuries. Before the time of the early Greek philosopher and that of Saint Thomas Aquinas, Buddhism developed into a great religion movement. Buddhism developed into a great religious movement in India, changed its outlook almost completely, declined, and finally sank back into the Hinduism from which it has emerged, but only after Buddhist missionaries has spread their message throughout half of Asia. The Athenian Acropolis was at least 500 years old before the first surviving Hindu stone temple was built. Some of the most popular gods of Hinduism, for instance, Ganesha and Hanuman, are not attested until well after the time of Christ. Certain other features of Hinduism also, for instance, the cult of the divine Rama and the complex and difficult system of physical training known as Hatha Yoga, are centuries later than Christianity. Yet the older strata of India's cultural life go back far beyond anything we have in the West. The whole of the Rig Veda had been composed long before the Iliad, and there is hardly anything in the Old Testament in its present form which is as old even as the latest Rigvedic hymns. Some practices and beliefs of popular Hinduism, for instance, the cults of the sacred bull and the people tree, are as old as prehistoric Harappa culture and probably even older. In fact, every generation in India for over 4,000 years have bequeathed, bequeathed something, if only a very little, to posterity. No land on earth has such a long cultural continuity as India, since though there were more ancient civilizations, notably in Egypt and Iraq, they are virtually forgotten by the inhabitants of those lands. and were overlaid by new intrusive cultures until nobody remembered the Book of the Dead or the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the kings such as Ramesh Sek- Ra- Ramesses II and Hammurabi were not recorded in any living tradition. Only 19th century scholarship resurrected them from oblivion, and if they are now national heroes remembered by every school child in their respective lands. This is not This is not thank either to the historical genius or to the retentive folks' memory of the centuries concerned. On the other hand, in India, the Brahman still repeats in his daily worship Vedic hymns composed over 3,000 years ago, and tradition recalls heroic chieftains and the great battles fought by them at about the same time. In respect of the length of continuous tradition, China comes second to India and Greece makes a poor third. A pre-Vedic Harappa culture bequeathed to later times sacred animals and trees, the mother goddess, and preoccupation with personal cleanliness and less certainly other aspect of Indian culture. From the Vedic Aryans came many of the gods. The Vedic hymns, some of the most important personal ritual of Hinduism, the patriarchal and patrilineal family system, and the horse. Later Vedic times, 1000 to 600 BC, brought the passion for speculation on ultimate causes, the quest for the absolute, the doctrine of transmigration, the search for release from the round of birth, and mystical genosis in social life and material culture. The same period saw the crystallization of the four classes varnas of Hindu society, the introduction of iron from West Asia, the domestication of the elephant, and the development of kingdoms out of tribal chieftainship. In the following 300 years, coined money became common, and writing known in the time of the Harappa culture and later apparently forgotten became widespread. Heterodox teachers, chief of whom was the Buddha, is spread new doctrine which bypassed the gods, the Vedas, and the Brahmans, and the area of civilization steadily expanded into the remoter parts of the subcontinent. Political developments over the preceding period led to the first great empire of India, that of the Mauryas, when when for the first time most of the subcontinent were united under a single government. This period, uh, 320 to 185 BC, Sri 320 to 185 BC, produced the Machiavellian system of statecraft associated with the name of the minister Kautilya, the reputed author of the famous Arthashastra. From the Mauryas also came the earliest surviving stone sculpture of India, the oldest artificial caves, and the most ancient Buddhist stupas. Under Ashoka, c. 272 to 232 BC, Buddhism increased its influence and was taken to Ceylon. The 500 years between the Mauryas and the Guptas, c. 184 BC to AD 320, saw tremendous developments in Indian civilization, partly due to fresh influences brought in by various invaders and traders, and partly the result of internal developments. New forms of devotional religion emerged, centering on the gods Vishnu and Shiva, and these led to the composition of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the most influential text of Hinduism, Buddhism developed a theology, the Mahayana, which was carried to China. Schools of law appeared, codifying in a written form earlier traditions. The two great epic of India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were edited in something like their present form. Courtly literature began developing out of vanished prototypes, drama ranging from the heroic to the sentimental, and was wonderful in its polish and a ingenuity, yet often filled with deep and sincere feeling. Logically reasoned, philosophical schools emerged as distinct from the older religious teachers, most of whose arguments were analogical. Contact with the Southeast Asia became closer with the spread of trade, and that region began to adopt many features of the religion and culture of India. These are only a few of the many invocations of this, perhaps the most formative period of Indian history before the 19th century. The period from the rise of the Guptas to the death of Harshvardhana 320 to 647 can truly be called the classical period of Indian civilization. In this age, the greatest sculpture of sculpture of ancient India was produced, and the finest literature written in the poems and plays of Kalidas. This was the time of the best surviving ancient Indian mm, mural painting, typified by Ajanta. Knowledge grew also in this period. India's most important practical contribution to the world, the system of the system of place notation of numerals with 9 digits as a zero, was known by AD 500 and led to the great development of Indian mathematics and astronomy. The recording of ancient legends and traditions in the Puranas began. The mother goddess, after centuries of neglect, became an important object of worship again. Stone-built temples appeared throughout the land. Between the death of Harshvardhana and the coming of Islam, c. 647 c. to 1200, the ecstatic devotional religion bhakti associated with the singing of hymns in the common tongue appeared in Tamil Nadu, later to spread all over the subcontinent. Temple became larger and grander with spring towers. The system of Hatha Yoga was developed, and Tantrism, with its Sac- sacramentalism of sex spread in both Hinduism and Buddhism. In Sankara and Ramanuja, Hindu religious philosophy saw its greatest teachers. Some of the finest schools of bronze casting in the world appeared in Bengal and Tamil Nadu. The former religion also developed a fine school of miniature painting. With the coming of Islam, fresh cultural influence made themselves felt. The Sultanate period, 1192 to 1526, saw the introduction of new style of architecture, bringing the dome and arch. New schools of miniature painting, both Muslim and Hindu, emerged. Sufi teachers disseminated the doctrine of Islam and helped to make the religious climate of northern India favorable to the spread of popular devotional Hinduism from the south. Paper was introduced slowly, replacing the traditional Indian writings material, palm leaf and beech bark. The Urdu language began to appear as the lingua franca of northern India, and poets began to compose in everyday languages instead of classical Sanskrit. The great day of the Mughal Empire 1526 to 1707 witnessed the perfection of the school of Muslim architecture and miniature painting, with the production of such splendid buildings as the Taj Mahal at Agra. Cannons and smaller firearms began to be used in warfare. Europeans uh, established trading stations at various ports, and through them, especially the Portuguese, new crops were introduced into India, among them two potato, tobacco, the pineapple, and surprisingly the spice, which nowadays is commonly thought typical of India, the chili pepper. The Sikh religion was born just as this period began, as a small devotional sect, and at about the time when the period concluded. It was reborn as a martial martial brotherhood to play an important part in the confused political life of the following century. The 18th century saw the breakup of the Mughal Empire and the steady expansion of the power of the British East India Company. It was a time of general cultural decline in India, but the genesis of the land was still at work. The Urdu language, little used hitherto as a medium of literary expansion, became the vehicle of great poetry at the descent courts of Delhi and Lucknow, while in the Himalayan foothills at the end of the century, at the petty courts of local Maharajas, by some unexplainable miracle, there worked painters who produced works of unprecedented beauty and sensitivity. With the 19th century, the subcontinent was exposed to the full force of Western influence, and innovations are too numerous to list. As well as this great legacy of the human past, the people of the subcontinent have another inheritance from nature itself, the land and its climate. We cannot understand South Asia without knowing something about what its people have received from the pri- primeval forces which shaped the surface of the earth millions of years before man existed. In this sense, perhaps India's most important inheritance is the great chain of Himalayas, without which the land would be little more than a desert. As the plateau of Central Asia grows warmer in the spring, the warm air rises, the wind bearing heavy masses of clouds are attracted towards the high tableland from the Indian Ocean. The movement of the clouds are interrupted by the mountains, and they shed their burden of rain upon the parched, overheated land. The monsoon, beginning in June, lasts for about 3 months and brings water for the whole year except along the coast and in a few other especially favored areas. There is little or no rain in other seasons, and thus the life of almost the whole subcontinent depends on the monsoon. The conservations and just sharing out of the available water among the cultivators is a very important factor in the life of India. It has been one of the main concern of Indian governments for over 2500 years, uh, and indeed the high civilization which is discussed in the pages of this book has depended and still largely depends on irrigation, promoted and survived by government for its very existence. In the past, whenever the rains have been inadequate, there has been famine. Whenever a local government has lost grip and became ineffective, irrigation has been neglected, dams have broken, canals have been choked with the mud and weed. The great hardship has resulted. Thus, villagers have learned to cooperate independently of their rulers by forming their own village governments under a committee of locally respected leaders. The panchayat to care for matters of common concern such as irrigation and to settle dispute as far as possible outside the royal courts. On the large scale, the climate has perhaps encouraged autocracy, but at the local level, it has necessitated government by discussion. South of South of the Himalayas lie the great plains of the subcontinent. The centuries from which civilization expanded in ancient times, composed of deep slit carried down by the rivers Indus, Sindhus, and Ganges. These plains are naturally very fertile, but for centuries they have supported a dense population whose whose peasants use the most easily available form of available form of manure, cow dung as fuel. Hence, the fertility of the plains declined until by the end of the last century, many areas had reached the rock bottom of productivity, from which they have begun to emerge only recently with the introduction of artificial fertilizers and the spread of knowledge of better agriculture methods. In ancient days, however, the fertility and the healthy, well-fed peasantry of India was noticed by foreign travelers from the Greek Greek Megasthenes c. 300 BC onwards. South of the Ganga are the Vindhya mountains and the long and beautiful river Narmada, dividing the north from the plateau region of Maharashtra, generally called the Deccan from Sanskrit Dakshina south. The region less naturally fertile than the Great Plains has been for at least 2000 years the home of tough material peasant who, whenever energetic leadership appeared to consolidate their clans, would uh, would take advantage of the political weakness of their neighbors to raid the wealthier land to the north, southeast, and south. The Deccan Plateau becomes steadily less rugged and more fertile as one proceeds south and southeast along the eastern littoral of the pe- peninsula are fertile riverine plains, the most important historically being that of Tamil Nadu, reaching from Madras to Cape Comorin, Kanyakumari, the extreme southern tip of India. Here, over 2000 years ago, the Tamil people developed a fairly advanced civilization independently of the Aryan North. This region has throughout its history maintained a consciousness of its differences from the north and has cherished its own language while remaining parts of the whole Indian cultural area. There may be an analogy between the Tamil attitude to the northern Aryans and that of the well uh, Wales to the English, with the difference that while many Welshmen have English as their mother tongue, few, if any, Tamils have a mother tongue other than Tamil. Yet another inheritance of India from the distant past is her people. Despite the difficult mountain passes and the wide seas bearing access to India, people have been mm, ways finding their way there from the days of the old Stone Age, where a small hordes of primitive men drifted into the subcontinent. These are probably the ancestors of one of India's three main racial types. The prototypes are Aus- Australoid, so called because of the resemblance to the Australian aborigine. In India, the most pure proto-Australoid type is to be found among the tribal people of the wilder parts of the peninsula, but Proto-Australoid feature can be traced almost everywhere in the subcontinent, especially among people of low caste. The ideal type is short, dark-skinned, broad-nosed, and large-mouthed. The next main stratum in the population of India is the Plateau Mediterranean, often loosely called Dravidian, a term not now favored by anthropologists. These people seem to have come to South Asia from the west not very long before the dawn of civilization in the Indus Valley, and they may have contributed to the foundation of the Harappa culture. Graceful and slender, with well well chiseled features and ac- aquiline noses, the ideal type is particularly to be found among the better class speakers of Dravidian language, but also occurs everywhere in the subcontinent. Then, in the second millennium BC, came the Aryans, speakers of an Indo-Aryan language, which was the cousin of those of classical Europe. Some have suggested that these people came in two or more waves. The earlier invaders being round-headed uh, brachycephalic people of the type called Alpine and Armenoid, and the later long-headed folk, typical Cau- Caucasoid, similar the build to northern European. Long before they entered India, the people who called themselves Aryans had intermixed with other peoples, and their advent meant a severe cultural decline, which lasted for many centuries. Only when Aryan culture was fertilized by the indigenous culture did it begin to to civ- uh, s- form the classical civilization of India. There are good arguments for the view. Then there are good arguments for the view that in the finished product, non-Aryan elements are more numerous than Aryan. Nowadays, a Caucasoid type is chiefly to be found in Pakistan, Kashmir, and the Punjab. But even here, one rarely meets pure or neatly pure specimens. As one proceeds east and south, the type becomes progressively rarer. These these three, the proto-asteroid, the Paleo-Mediterranean, and the Caucasoid or Indo-European, are the most strongly represented racial type among the inhabitants of India, but they are by no means the only ones. Almost every race of Central Asia found in its way to India. Turks provided the ruling families in which of what is now Pakistan long before the coming of the Muslims, who were also Turks. Mongolians of various races have been entering India over the Himalayan and northeastern passes since long before history. The Muslim ruling classes imported numerous African slaves who have long since merged with the general general population. Persian and Arab traders settled along the west coast from before the Christian era. Some married Indian women, and the descendants have become indistinguishable from the rest of the population. Others, such as the small but vigorous Parsi community, have kept their stock pure. The various European traders and conquerors have left their mark also. Along the west coast of India and Ceylon, an appreciable quantity of Portuguese blood circulated in the veins of the general population, while elsewhere in India, the so-called Anglo-Indian community, in the result of many marriages and lic- license license between European, not only British soldiers and traders, the Indian women. Thus, in reading these chapters, we must also remember India's enduring inheritance of climate, land, and people, on the basis of which her high civilization has been built, and which will remain more or less unchanging to condition the lives of her people in all their times and basi- vicissitude in future centuries. Thank you.